Good afternoon to all our dear viewers. Article 18 and 19 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights stipulate the rights of freedom of expression. Article 18 enshrines in it that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, consciousness and religion. In Article 19, it stipulates that everyone has the right freedom of opinion and expression, and this right includes the freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek information and ideas through any media regardless of frontiers. In accordance to the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, the Congress shall make no law with respect to establishing official religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of people to peacefully assemble for a redress of grievances. And yet, despite these freedoms being supposedly enshrined in the Constitution and charters, we've seen actions on the contrary. The United States government, amongst others, have banned television networks from airing. Television networks from many countries, be it Russian, Venezuelan, Cuban, Yemeni, Iraqi, Iranian, and countless other channels. We simply ask, why is this the case? Are there political motives behind this? And why is it that one rule appears to only apply to some channels and not to others, when there are channels who get away with hate speech or promoting sectarianism, for example? For those who don't know, the Journalist Support Committee is an organization that supports and promotes independent journalism. Follow us on our social media handle, JSC Press, on YouTube as well as Instagram. The title of today's event is Blocking Media Organizations Violates Media Expression. We have an exciting panel of speakers who are passionate about their work and come from a range of backgrounds. Joining us in the studio today, we have Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, publisher and editor with Politics First. He's a historian, analyst, and author specializing in Russia. His most recent book is Arise Russia, The Return of Russia in World Politics. Welcome, Marcus, on the show.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for having me.
It is a huge honor and delight to have you on the show with us today. As I mentioned in my introduction, what we are facing in the media and the world today is this increased censorship in the governments, and of course with yourself, with the analysis that you come from the Russian politics and beyond. The viewers would love to hear about your take on this and what are the legal implications of all of these and what can be done, quite simply.
Certainly. Well, first of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to Islamic Radios and Televisions Union for organising and hosting this evening's conference and for having me as one of the speakers. And thank you too to those who are watching tonight's conference in numerous countries around the world. Freedom of expression is absolutely central to the notion of democracy. Indeed, there can be no democracy without it. The right of a man or woman or a child to express their opinions and thoughts either verbally or in writing or both in public and without any repercussions, whether overt or disguised, is what determines whether a society is democratic. That actuality is irrefutable, regardless if the opinions put forward by someone in public are considered by some to be offensive or disrespectful or insensitive. Regrettably, the words offensive, disrespectful and insensitive are just some which have been appropriated and distorted by neoliberals in the West, including the woke movement and specifically BLM, to impose neoliberal values on the majority of the populations in societies across the West, which includes, amongst others, an intolerance of diversity of opinions and ideas, the destruction of all religions, including Christianity and Islam, the dismembering of the identities and rights of men, women and children, and the promotion of a drug-fueled and sexually perverted culture. Now, returning to freedom of expression, the West, by which I mean the nucleus of this, America and Britain, purports to be the heart and soul of freedom of expression, together with being its principal champion and defender. Regrettably, but unsurprisingly, considerable numbers of lay Americans and Britons believe the notion that the American and British states are the foremost beacons for freedom of expression. However, the notion that the American and British states are the foremost beacons for freedom of expression is simply a fallacy, while in truth, the American and British establishments know this to be the case, as their key objective is actually to preserve Western global hegemony so as to conserve their power, influence and wealth, rather than advancing the cause of freedom of expression. Guardians of freedom of expression is but a sham image which the American and British establishments have constructed over centuries now of themselves as part of their reason for being, both domestically and internationally. It follows, therefore, that the establishments in America and in Britain seek to restrict any point of view which contradicts their narratives and thereby threatens their goals, while simultaneously ensuring that their respective domestic audiences are told, via American and British mainstream media, what the powers that be in Washington and London want them to be told. Further to that, it matters not what the subject matter is. It could be Iran, or it could be Syria, or it could be Russia, or it could be what is known as COVID-19. The American and British establishments will force-feed the American and British publics the official narrative of Washington and London on, say, Iran or COVID-19, principally by employing mainstream media outlets in America and in Britain, such as CNN or the New York Times or BBC News or The Guardian, which are all neither free nor independent, because they are part of, in fact, are at the centre of the American and British establishments. For many years now, including long before I became a public figure, I have spoken with ordinary Britons on how British mainstream media lacks both impartiality and credibility and constitutes instead propaganda weapons of the British state. I have also pointed out in my discussions with Britons the dangerous implications for them and their families about being deceived by a media which purports to be on their side. Time and time again, those ordinary Britons would say to me that what was happening in, say, Bosnia or Syria did not affect their lives because these were events occurring on lands far from Britain. My response to that was to say that first, it should be of deep concern that Britain has neither a free nor independent media, because it means that Britain is not actually a democratic country. And so everything which Britons are told from cradle to grave about Britain being a democracy is a falsehood. Second, that British media deceives the British public about events in far-flung parts of the world means, in practice, that it is more than capable and prepared to lie about matters back home in Britain. And third, that British mainstream media presents false accounts about, for instance, Kosovo, Libya or Syria, could have serious ramifications for the safety and security of the British public. That all said, however, I can sit here today and say that, quite refreshingly, more and more Britons now realise the detrimental effects, both to them and their family members, of the actuality that Britain is devoid of a free media. Thus, many Britons are now conscious of how, for instance, the personnel of the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army or the so-called Syrian rebels, whom British mainstream media lauded day and night, 24 hours a day, as freedom fighters, innocents and morally superior people, are, in fact, plaguing British society today with drugs, human, including child, trafficking, paedophilia and guns, in the case of the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, or are threatening British society with extremism and terrorism, in the case of the so-called Syrian rebels. Nevertheless, it is with regret, but with no surprise, that I can also say that the majority of the British public are still completely unaware that when they watch British mainstream news channels such as Sky News, or when they read British mainstream newspapers such as The Times, they are subjecting themselves to some of the most powerful and poisonous propaganda techniques that the world has ever known. In short, by exposing themselves to British mainstream media, Britons are putting themselves in harm's way. So, for example, most Britons are ignorant, because they expose themselves to British mainstream media, that it is the combined efforts of Russia and Iran that have all but destroyed Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, that Iran is pivotal in fighting both Al-Qaeda and ISIS, that Saudi Arabia is the foremost financier of terrorism in the world, that the British state, along with the American one, is an unofficial patron of both Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and that terrifying levels of societal control emerging in Britain today on the back of what is known as COVID-19 is being glossed over by British mainstream media. Accordingly, when a Briton watches, say, Good Morning Britain, or reads, for instance, The Economist, they are in effect placing themselves in harm's way of the British establishment, consuming, whether consciously or subconsciously, British state propaganda. Nonetheless, all is not well for the American and British establishments in the world today in relation to the hold that they have over their respective domestic audiences. Unlike for in the 1990s, when Western mainstream media was without challenge and was thereby able to say whatever it wanted to about, for example, Croatia, Bosnia and Kosovo without any inhibitions, the situation now is quite different. True, it is far from ideal, but nevertheless it is infinitely better than how it was some 30 years ago. The positive change is, to a large extent, on account of the emergence of alternative media outlets in countries which are of geostrategic influence. Thus, there is Russia's RT, Iran's Press TV, Lebanon's Al Mayadeen, China's CGTN, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua and Bolivia's Telesur, together with Iraq's Al Teja TV and the Bahraini Lula TV. Because of the professionalism and dedication of the journalists on the aforementioned news channels, Western mainstream media has lost significant ground in what has become a global information war. In response to the birth of alternative news channels, the American and British establishments have resorted to either denying broadcasting licenses to or placing tremendous pressure on these channels. And why? Well, officially because RT and Press TV, for instance, are, respectively, Russian and Iranian state propaganda channels. Now, such an argument is as much untenable as it is juvenile, because precisely who determines what propaganda is and who exactly applies this? The answer to that is the American and British establishments, which are firstly not impartial and secondly not representative by any stretch of the imagination of their respective publics. The American and British establishments serve themselves and are answerable only to themselves. Furthermore, and most importantly of all, the obstructions which Washington and London place before alternative news channels are a flagrant violation of Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1948, which Washington and London as UN members are bound by, and which states that, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers." End quote. Thus, as members, indeed permanent members of the UN, Britain and America are contravening a key pillar of the UN by curtailing freedom of expression in their persecution of alternative news channels, because they are restricting the American and the British people's ability to learn about different opinions and ideas from outside of America and Britain. And in Britain's case, that persecution is principally carried out by the infamous Ofcom, which is, for all intents and purposes, the British establishment's censorship agency. Further, the British state also utilises British mainstream media, which, as I said earlier, it owns and controls, to denigrate the views being explored by alternative media, as well as to speak ill of those who are putting forward such views in interviews with these outlets. In essence, British mainstream media is used by the British state to dirty, in full view of the British population, the credibility of any argument and the integrity of any individual as it sees fit to. Thus, in practice, such opinions are referred to by British mainstream journalists either on television or on radio or in writing or on social media as extremist, propaganda, conspiracy theories and unhinged, to name but a few, while those who express the views are characterised by British mainstream journalists as genocide deniers, propagandists, apologists, idiots, mentally unstable and anti-Semitic, again, to name but a few. Now, the actual reason as to why the American and British establishments take action against alternative news channels is because, firstly, the views being covered by these outlets are diametrically opposed to those of the official narratives of Washington and of London on topics of high significance as designated by the ruling elite in both America and Britain. Secondly, the plausibility of the views being voiced are sufficient enough to weaken the narratives of the American and British states. And thirdly, the attainment of goals pursued by the American and British establishments is potentially jeopardized because these credible opinions are undermining the official narratives in Washington and in London. Accordingly, in the case of Britain, both RT and Press TV have been victimised by the British state's de facto censorship agency, Ofcom, because both, vis-à-vis the conflict in Syria, have persuasively made the case to their British audiences that the rebels in Syria are actually Al-Qaeda or ISIS terrorists, that the Syrian government is fighting against terrorism with the overwhelming support of the Syrian people, that the British state is in league with both Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and that Russia and Iran have played the cardinal role in annihilating with military force the aspirations of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria and indeed in the Middle East in general. It is at this point that I should say that if the British establishment is so ashamed of its dirty links to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and is determined that these be kept from the knowledge of the British public, then, quite simply, it should stop supporting these rancid groups to begin with, stop using its media to cover up these ties, and put a stop to its media and its de facto censorship agency, Ofcom, in their tormenting of alternative media outlets for helping to expose these most revolting of links. As we know, freedom of expression is a fundamental human right, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which America and Britain since 1948 have been bound to. Yet the American and British states are two of the chief violators on the international scene today of freedom of expression, regardless of their preposterous and by now tiring assertions to the contrary. Furthermore, mainstream journalists in America and in Britain are not, in truth, journalists. Instead, they are purveyors of propaganda on behalf of the American and British establishments and care nothing for journalism or the truth or freedom of expression. Only money and satisfying their ego is what drives them on and on and on. And they will use their power that the American and British states have bestowed on them to ruin the lives of independent and critical thinking journalists who, unlike for them, are sincerely committed to what it means to be a journalist. That the American and British states constitute some of the world's worst violators of freedom of expression is indicative of their true nature. Rather than being guardians of freedom of expression, the British and American states are leading foes of freedom of expression. The American and British establishments deny their publics the freedom to enjoy Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as we are aware of, is the freedom to receive informations and ideas through any media outlet in the world so as to help allow them to form their own opinions on subject matters. The restrictions which the American and British elites impose on their own peoples is for the purposes of controlling what the average American or Briton thinks, which will then allow Washington and London to freely pursue their interests, not the interests of America or Britain, but their interests, both at home and abroad. The mindsets of the American and the British establishments is therefore clear. He who controls the media is able to mould public opinion however he wants to. Today, when more and more Britons, along with increasing numbers of Americans, are grasping the reality that they have long been deceived and manipulated by British and American mainstream media outlets, we, who are committed to freedom of expression, must not lose momentum, because the tide is beginning to turn. The masks of the American and British establishments have slipped on account of the conceit of the elites in Washington and in London, their complacency, the natural inclination of many human beings to question and seek information for themselves, and the arrival of alternative news channels. Only when the masks of the American and British states have fallen completely will there be an opportunity for Americans and Britons to know what it is truly to enjoy freedom of expression, a human right which has been denied to them by their ruling elites over centuries through, in large part, the virus that is Western mainstream media. Change is coming, our day is coming. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marcus, for that amazing insight into the state of Western media, especially pointing out the hypocrisy in a way that they claim to be one thing, but in reality, through their actions, it really is something else. It's really about pushing a certain narrative, and you mentioned earlier as well, it's not just something that happens in the media, it's kind of become in society, that cancel culture that you pointed out. Even if it's a view that, even if it's not a right view or a wrong view, it should still be something that should be allowed to be expressed. People shouldn't feel scared to express a view, because that is the case, for sure. One thing that's very interesting that you mentioned was who determines what propaganda is, right? Like what actually can be defined as propaganda, because you may say they will say, oh, the Iranians or the Russians, who are usually labeled as such. But what's to say that, as you also mentioned, the British media outlets or the American media outlets, who obviously are projecting America or British power internationally through their media, who's to say, for example, that cannot be classed as propaganda, for example? When you see the groups or events, for example, in Syria, the groups that are fighting there, you mentioned, for example, people will be called apologists or proxies or these other words, but you never hear about it being labeled as American-backed proxy or American-backed, but it's always Iranian-backed or Russian-backed. So what I wanted to ask in that sense is, how does one really determine what can be labeled as propaganda, and should that even be a word that we should be using in any case at all?
Well, first of all, I should say that the British and American establishments for many, many years now have been staggeringly successful in the facade that they have created, namely that they are both committed to freedom of expression. And though it is a facade, it is, as I said, remarkably successful. So successful that is one of their most powerful images which they project of themselves in the world. And it allows them to afford themselves the viewpoint that they are morally superior to, say, the Russians or the Iranians. Now, when it comes to propaganda, we have to acknowledge that every state in the world puts out its own form of propaganda. That is perfectly natural. I have no objections to that whatsoever. But I do have an objection when, let's take Britain or the British state, because the British state is not Britain. When the British state refers to RT or Press TV as propaganda, well, let the British public determine whether what they hear on Press TV or what they hear on RT is propaganda or not. Don't treat the British public as imbeciles. I have no problem in the British state expressing their opinion about Moscow and Tehran, but at the same time, they should remain committed to Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and say to the British public, we, as the British state, the British government, do not agree with the foreign policy directives of Moscow or Tehran, but nonetheless, we are committed to freedom of expression. We will allow RT and Press TV to broadcast in Britain without any constraints whatsoever. If that was the situation in Britain, then very probably we, or I suppose in particular myself, would not be sitting here now. But alas, that is not the case. The British state determines what is propaganda and what is not propaganda, and therein lies the reason why Britain, contrary to what British state propaganda says, is not a democracy.
It really is incredible when you think about it in the intricacies and the little ways that seem, as you said, a facade, but and just how effective that has been in portraying and projecting, as you said, the foreign policy directives and motives of the British state. And of course, that is the problem. We also have the case of, as you mentioned, false reporting of events, or underreporting, or covering events. And we mentioned that an alternative media is an answer to hold the state to account, ultimately, because that isn't what the mainstream media are doing. Do you think that, of course, you mentioned the Ofcom, although it's a regulator, it really is just promoting the interests of the state. Do you think that just having the alternative media presence as it is and just allowing them to air, do you think that's enough? And if, in terms of countering the narrative, and if it's not enough, what more should be done in terms of having a fair coverage and a fair balance of both sides of an argument?
That is an excellent question, and it's a very difficult question to actually answer. Firstly, the presence of alternative media such as RT and Press TV is absolutely vital, because it means that British mainstream media no longer have the field to themselves anymore. It means that ordinary Britons can now watch Press TV's coverage of, for example, the situation in Yemen. They can learn about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in what is the poorest country in the Middle East. They won't learn about that on BBC News, they won't learn about that on Sky News, but they will learn about that from Press TV. So I salute Press TV and RT, and long may they be in existence. Secondly, unfortunately, we live in a Britain today in which the cognitive levels of the average Briton has rapidly deteriorated on account of, amongst others, celebrity culture, reality television, a fascination in the interests it's a fascination in the sexualities of celebrities. Now, I have no doubt that the British state has encouraged reality television and celebrity culture as a way of distracting the British public from what is really going on in British society. For example, there are 14 million Britons living in poverty. There are 4 million British children living below the breadline. I think the British state is very well aware of what the Romans pioneered. Give them bread and circuses, and you will keep them distracted. So yes, having the likes of Press TV and RT is absolutely crucial, and we need to tell as many people as we can in Britain about them. But at the same time, that so many Britons are consumed with celebrity culture and reality television, and regrettably as well, alcohol and drugs, means that even if Press TV and RT continue to grow in Britain, there are still so many Britons who are just not interested. So I'm not being pessimistic, I'm being realistic about the situation.
No, the point you mentioned about these distractions are very true. We see certain newspapers, tabloid newspapers, who dedicate a whole front page over a particular celebrity wearing just a particular dress, for example. A celebrity just walking on the street, they're not doing anything. And attention being given to that when, as you mentioned, we have a homelessness crisis in the UK, drugs, alcohol, knife crime, God knows how many of these issues. And it's truly incredible to find that the state and the media has done such a good job of distracting the public. Obviously, we're talking about having the right narrative, but the problem here is having the narrative in the first place. Because at least that's one argument that alternative media can tackle, but an alternative media isn't the direct opposite to a celebrity culture, which is another thing that we have to find. So that's definitely something very eye-opening and to think about. I think what I want to be able to do is to bring in our second speaker, if that's possible. I'm not so sure if our second speaker is here. Just to introduce our second speaker whilst we try and get him, hopefully. Our second speaker is Mr. Osamak. And Osamak's an economist in the Schiller Institute in Sweden. He's a board member of the Swedish Association of Yemen Solidarity, and he visited Syria multiple times during the war and a co-author of Operation Phoenix Reconstruction Plan for Syria. He's was a panel member at an event about the alleged chemical weapons incident in Khan Sheikhoun at the UN Human Rights Commission, organized by the ICSFT in Geneva, and is a co-founder of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. So it is a huge honor and privilege to have you here with us. We welcome you. Are you able to hear us?
Yeah, hello.
Hi, hello.
I'm hearing you. I just had to take away the light.
Of course, it's an honor to have you on the show.
Great.
I hope I tried my best to introduce you in some way. And maybe you would have heard what we've been discussing regarding the freedom of expression in the media, regarding the rights of broadcasting opinions, the legal aspects of such, and that's what we wanted to hopefully discuss with you as well, regarding the European angle regarding media rights. What is there in the European laws and constitutions regarding the freedom of expression, and why it really is important that we get all views regarding an issue. So feel free to enlighten us on that.
Well, first of all, the control of media is belonging to the old paradigm to prevent any change. So, as you have said, it's a control system, just like the master's voice in the old colonial system. And the current world is ripe for explosive eruptions of tectonic shifts beyond the headlines of the media. And the new paradigm is emerging with China, together with Russia in the leadership of the developing nations. This has been seen already in the replacement of G8 to G20, and it's been seen in the tremendous success and popularity of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is now the vehicle for cooperation for 136 nations in all continents. The economic and political realignment of Russia and China, to which now Iran is coming in, is taking over more and more. And also the security organization of Shanghai Cooperation Organization is expanding its activities. So what we see here is an evolution of a new currency system outside the control of the dollar. A significant step was the groundbreaking strategic deal between China and Iran for economic cooperation outside the dollar system. And this has finally established a context for peace and reconstruction in Yemen. So this control system is very much in the center of London. And the Western media control is very much controlled through the BBC, which immediately when the radio broadcasting started, took the leadership to dominate this new media in much the same way as today the American tech companies try to put their hand on every new form of social media emerging. One example of that is the famous US radio project enlisting the British psychological war capabilities of Tavistock Institute from the colonial wars and World War II. So here in Sweden, we are well acquainted with this BBC control of radio news in Sweden, where the BBC news are copied to use or used to correct Swedish news, radio news every day. It works in this way. The BBC used their Far East offices before it was the one in Hong Kong they used to produce the BBC news ahead of time in Europe. When the Swedish radio starts in the morning, they have a full breakfast prepared for them many hours in advance by the BBC. If something else sneaks in the first morning news, it is corrected according to the BBC version immediately. All my life in Sweden, I have had to listen to the radio news, especially in the early mornings, as the important news mostly only show up once. And also in Sweden, during the whole Cold War, we had a military control of the news. It was organized through what is officially called the psychological defense, where Swedish journalists were mandated to take part in military-led exercises, simulated reporting in war conditions, where they were tested and selected for promotion in their respective publication houses. This is not just the past, as the Psychological Defense Authority has been resurrected as the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, in the same time as the whole network of government-controlled NGOs increasingly are controlling news production. The coordination of the media of these quasi-NGOs is also centralized directly from the British intelligence services through projects like Integrity Initiative, which also has the Nordic cluster, so-called, of journalists. So this is a problem for the media rights, because the media concentration and foreign ownership is seriously curtailing any media rights, especially as the Swedish justice system of media complaints are under corporativist control through the system of ombudsman. This government official, sharing a board of media companies' representatives, has effectively replaced the possibility to challenge any media in the special Swedish court system to uphold the 18th century law for freedom of publication. So this is the situation here. We have absolute control also here, and therefore, as part of this Western control system, what you have talked about, Marcus, and this is what we are fighting with. And I agree totally that this situation with the alternative media now coming out is absolutely crucial as to have a change in the world, and it's absolutely taking more and more part of the news for people who want to know what is really going on. I have some more answers to your questions, but maybe stop there.
Feel free to.
Yeah. Just to on the question of getting international news from the source, we in the Schiller Institute have therefore an ongoing process of conferences to organize a dialogue of civilization, enabling a dialogue that necessary to have those nations closed out of the Western media to take part. In the last conference in March 1920s this year, the media and political advisor of President Assad, Dr. Butaina Shaban, was invited to speak. Also, the foreign minister of Yemen, engineer Hisham Sharaf, made a presentation thanking the Schiller Institute and pointing to the need for the new paradigm of relations among the nations of the world. And I invite you to have a new conference we will have next Saturday, May 8th, with the Schiller Institute. Just check for it on schillerinstitute.com. It's in one word. But coming back to the change now going on in the media world, I would like to take up what you pointed to going on in the United States with the President Trump and his campaign against the media there, and these came out because Trump was brutally targeted by the media for his opposition to the forever wars, but also his potential resistance to Wall Street, where he is in the campaign demanded the breakup of the major banks according to the old Glass-Steagall system. Trump's resistance and denunciation of the fake media has forever taken away the trust for media among broad strata in the Western world. So I think we are in a new situation now because of this, and because it has exposed very much the major Western media as believer in the ultra-liberal relativistic concept of truth. As they're under this concept.
I think we've just briefly lost our
Hello. Hello.
Hello. I think we can't see your video, but you can continue to speak if you can hear, Doctor. Okay, no problem. Whilst that gets sorted in the meantime, we'll just reflect on some points that he mentioned. He spoke a lot in terms of also the shift in foreign relations, in terms of new alliances being formed. We have, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative with China, the Shanghai Corporation as well, to shift the reliance financially away from the United States. How significant do you think, although that's not directly linked to the media, initiatives such as those to have a sort of a new currency system or a system that is not reliant on the American currency, how much of an effect do you think that actions such as that could have on the state control on the media narrative and the way they can project it globally?
Well, I'm certainly of the opinion that if the dollar was to lose its supreme position in the world, then naturally the geopolitical dynamics of the world would change overnight as well. However, I am not of the opinion that China is going to be the country responsible for putting the dollar into second position, and that through doing that, China will create a more just world. Why do I believe that? Because the Chinese economic miracle has been based overwhelmingly on China's trade and investment relationship with America. The Chinese and American economies are entwined, and whilst there is significant tension between Beijing and Washington, indeed there is a trade war, there is a military build-up in the South China Sea, but involving the Americans and the Chinese, China knows that if its trade and investment relationship with America was to be severed, then the Chinese economy almost overnight would go into a disastrous recession. I'm not saying the American economy wouldn't, it certainly would, but the American economy is so much more powerful, so much more diverse in every single way than the Chinese economy is. So I do not believe that China is constitutes the hope in some people's minds in, for example, Western Europe.
That's a very valid point. It's just highlighting the nature of globalization and how relations are not. It's not as simple as we think that a country will quite simply break off. There is, of course, the desire of China to project its own influence, but the reality is that the countries are interdependent on each other. So, although they may reduce their dependence and at least take away some influence, realistically, as you mentioned, it's highly unlikely that you really would be able to break away completely in that context. So that's a very valid and interesting point. Another point that he mentioned, of course, was we were talking about the state control of the British state control on the one thing that he mentioned, of course, was the effect of British state control on Swedish television and radio, and the radio and TV control in other countries. So although us in Britain, we will try and look for ways to hold that own country to account. How do you feel that those in other countries can stop or hold the foreign powers to account when obviously they're not in those countries? Is that something that they have to hold their own governments to account, or what is the way?
It's a peculiar reality, and I say peculiar in both sociological and psychological terms, that, for example, in Sweden, a significant percentage of the population are wary of BBC News.
Right.
Yet they watch BBC News. They might be shouting at the television set when there's a BBC News report on, for example, about Syria or about Israel or about Yemen. But the very fact they have turned on BBC News shows in the first place how there's this subconscious attachment to BBC News. And it goes back to what I said earlier on in our discussion, how the British establishment is extraordinarily successful in having made BBC News, BBC known throughout the world, even in countries which have very difficult relationships with the United Kingdom. People in those countries are still watching BBC News. So if there's going to be significant change vis-a-vis Western mainstream media in a country such as Sweden, then quite simply, people there have to stop tuning in to BBC News. They have to stop going to the Twitter page of BBC News. They have to stop going to the Facebook page of BBC News. So really, the spell that BBC News has over hundreds of millions of people, including in parts of China, such as Hong Kong, has to be broken. And we have to keep on using alternative media. We have to keep on using social media as a way of breaking that spell over hundreds of millions of people in the world.
No, that really is an excellent point. I think now we have Dr. Off, I believe, is back. Is he? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Dr. Off is reconnected or not.
You are live. You are live in the TV now. You are live.
Yes, I saw the picture you sent to me.
No, I can hear you on the TV. Don't speak with me now. Speak with he asked me question.
Okay, in this case, we will move on to our next panel guest. Our next panel guest is Ishaq Adam. He is a law graduate from Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, Kaduna State, Nigeria, and attended the Nigerian Law School at Bwari Abuja. He's a human rights lawyer and a specialization in human rights activity. We welcome you onto the show.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us on the show. It is a huge privilege and honor to hear you on the show. We've been talking about media narratives, and very often the media narratives is you know, we're talking about Europe and North America and Asia, but not often, quite rarely, do we get to hear the perspective and opinions of in Africa about the effect of media censorship over there. And we would be delighted to have you enlighten us and discuss with us how media censorship is being impacted in Africa and the influence of Western powers on that.
Yes. Considering the moment, the role played by the media this time, at this moment, is very, very important and crucial. Freedom of expression is a notion that every person has the natural rights that gives by almost every constitution. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right that's being distilled from natural law, which every individual has the right to express his opinion. Having said that, for us to, when we are talking of freedom of expression in Africa, as well as in Nigeria particularly, we are to consider these laws. Here in Africa, we have African Charter on Human and People's Rights. We also have International Covenant on Human, on Civic and Political, Civil and Political Rights. And also we have Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Then in Nigeria, coming back to Nigerian law, we have 1999 Constitution as amended, Section 39 in particular. We also have Freedom of Information Act 2011. These laws discuss very diligently the right of expression, to express yourself, or to seek for information, any information that is public. So these laws discuss all about these rights. Therefore, any attempt or any acts of violating these rights is contrary to those laws. Therefore, the role of media in this on this is very, very vital, because all this law, both international law and the civic or Nigerian law, have the provision. The African Charter, for instance, in one of its articles, that is precisely Article 19, provides that every individual has the right to express himself, and also have the right to acquire or to seek any information from a public organization. So these are the, as well as on the other hand, Section 19 sub 2 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights also has the similar provision. On the other hand, again, in Nigeria, we have Section 1999 Constitution. We have Section 39, which is similar to the Section 19 of the Declaration of the Universal Declaration on Human and People's Rights. We also have freedom of information, which has the provision which provide in Section 1 of subsection 1 of the law. that every individual has the right to acquire or to cover any information or to seek any information from anywhere, from any public organization. These are the law that we are having to discuss and brainstorm the rights, those rights of freedom of expression and freedom to acquire or to seek information for from any governmental organization or any government agency. Yes.
Thank you so much. You mentioned quite evidently that there are, as in the case of the countries that we discussed, that there are laws in place, supposedly laws in place that are meant in writing to protect the freedom of media expression, the freedom of seeking information that is on public record for the intention of holding governments and the state to account. What I wanted to ask Barrister is, you mentioned that there are these laws in place, but in reality, could you shed some light on some examples where this wasn't the case, where either a media channel may have been shut down or individuals who were merely expressing their views and opinions were arrested just for expressing and not for breaking any particular law? So are you able to share some examples where such laws and freedom requests were violated?
Well, having said that, having enumerated the above mentioned laws, so any attempt to block media from covering a particular or from seeking a particular information, such act violates the freedom of expression, which is contrary to Section 39 of the 1999 Constitution, and contrary to Section 1, subsection 1 of the Freedom of Information Act, and also contrary to Article 9 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, also contrary to Article 19 sub 2 of the Universal Declaration on Human and People's Rights. So any such acts that violates these rights, individual or the victim has the right to seek legal redress in court. For instance, in Africa, we have two courts. We have ECOWAS court. We also have African Court of Justice. So there are many cases where those courts deliver their decision on freedom, on violating freedom of expression as well as information. Now, in Nigeria, in current situation, we have Sheikh Ibrahim Zazzaki, his case that is before a high court here in Kaduna State. Such case is very, very crucial, but the security agencies denied the journalists, denied the freedom of expression, the freedom of information. That is, they contravene, they violate all those laws. So we are saying that the situation must be changed. The government has to allow anybody to attend to hear the proceeding. The media has the right to cover any court proceeding. They have the right. The Constitution, they have constitutional right. They have the rights given by provided by the Freedom of Information Acts, particularly Section 1, subsection 2. They have the rights, but in Nigeria, we are having those problems. This is one case that which I made mention, the case of Sheikh Ibrahim Zegzeki, where the case is right now in courts, in High Court in Kaduna, where the security agencies denied journalists from covering the proceeding.
Right, so the case you mentioned there of the media not being allowed to cover court cases and therefore not being able to hold the court accountable ultimately, because it is the responsibility of justice to uphold the rule of law and impartiality. That is the basis in which we're meant to have trust in the justice system. One important question I thought I'd ask Dr. Marcus as he's here is, obviously the laws say that, at least in theory, you know, a media channel is allowed to express its views and opinions. And obviously we've seen instances where they have been shut down or banned. What pretexts would you say are used to justify banning a channel? Because we talked about, okay, labeling a channel as a propaganda or something, but there has to be a reason that is used in order to justify shutting down channels. Because they wouldn't say they're shutting down because they have a different opinion. So what reasons would you say are often used to justify?
Well, in the case of the British and American establishments, they will cite the reason of national security threat. And secondly, they will argue that the views being covered by alternative media channels constitute a threat to the harmony of American and British societies. Now, if they want to make that argument, then so be it. But they need to do it in a court of law. And they cannot go to a court of law and argue that they have evidence, very credible evidence and sources, that what was aired on, let's say, an Iranian news channel constitutes a danger to the national security of Britain, but that they can't reveal the names of the sources or any specific information, because that would also endanger British national security. Now, that is a very clever argument, but it's not an argument that can't be taken apart. But nonetheless, such a case rarely will go to court in the first place. And if it does go to court, then quite frankly, the judge will always rule in favour of the British state. It's what is known as telephone justice. The judges in England and Wales, and of course in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, are overwhelmingly drawn from the ranks of the British establishment. And though they will hear a case, there is telephone justice at work, in that their decision has already been made up, not by the judge involved, but by the powers that be. So yes, we need to try and take such cases to court. We need to have high-profile solicitors and barristers taking up the cause of freedom of expression. But will there be a success in a court of law in England and Wales? I think not.
It's a very interesting point raised on how much trust there really is in the court of law and its ability to uphold justice and values and the Constitution. I want to bring in our barrister. I wanted to ask a similar question to what I asked Dr. Marcus. You mentioned how they have the case of Sheikh Zakzaki in Kaduna State, where the media are not allowed to cover court proceedings. Him himself, you mentioned he has certain rights that are being violated. Why? What would you say are the reasons for this being the case? Why are the media not being allowed to cover proceedings? What is the state so afraid of?
Sorry, come again.
I wanted to ask that you mentioned that the media is not being allowed to cover court cases in Nigeria. Especially, you mentioned the example of Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki. So I wanted to ask why you feel the reasons behind why media are not being allowed to cover court cases. Why journalists are not allowed in court to cover the cases. What are the reasons?
So actually, that is the question we are still asking the government. Why are they violating all these rights? Why they are not allowing the media to directly to cover the proceeding, because they have the right. And whenever that case is to be heard, that day, the day the case will be heard, they will block all the road, all the access road that will lead you to the court. They will block it and deny people going access to the road, which is this act is also contrary to Section 41, that is provide the right of movement. So they at the same time they violate many sections. They violate section. They violate right to right of the press to cover the proceeding. They also denied people their right of movement. So we are now still asking. We are still asking why. Why are they doing such act, despite the fact that even the court itself in many cases said that since the defendant are not coming to the court, so there is no need for the security agencies to cover to block all the roads. But this is the question. This is the question we are asking, that why are they blocking the road, such thereby violating the right of people and the right of the media to cover the proceeding. Also, there are the defendant has the right. A defendant has the constitutional right that his case to be heard publicly, in public. But this is the current situation, and this is what is happening in this case, in particular in Nigeria.
It's incredible, because we've also been talking about freedom of expression, but obviously we've got multiple freedoms that are being violated here and somehow unaccounted for. They're seemingly able to get away with it. No one seems to be, no international body seems to be saying much about it. So you've been asking the questions, as you said, why is this the case? Why are they being, or why are the roads being blocked and so on? Do you possibly have a theory, maybe, as to why this may be the case? Even though, of course, all of you have been asking the questions. But is there maybe any theory as to why, in this situation, the freedoms are being blocked, and why they're going to such measures, such as blocking roads or other forms of freedom? Is there a theory?
Hello. Actually, I don't hear what you just said. I don't hear you.
That's fine. What I was saying is,
Yes,
you mentioned
yes.
that
The line is somehow fluctuating. The line is somehow fluctuating. I don't hear you.
Are you able to hear
I
now?
don't hear you.
Can you hear better now?
Hello.
Are you able to hear us now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good.
Please, could you repeat the
No
question?
problem. My question was about your question. You said and discussed that you have been, and you and other lawyers and barristers, you've been asking the question, why are these freedoms being violated? Why are they blocking the roads? Why? So I want to ask the simple question, although you haven't got maybe the proper answer from the government, who won't give it, but what is your theory as to why they are going to this extent to violate freedoms? Is there a theory?
Well, I get you well. It is quite clear that the government has it is the government that doesn't want the proceeding to be covered by the journalists. That is no more and no less. Yes.
Yes, it's incredible what to what extent governments will go through. We mentioned in our discussion here with Dr. Marcus about media cover-ups, for example, or whitewashing crimes, or relabeling them and falsifying any evidence or anything just to further the foreign policy directives of the state, in this case the British state. Now I'd like to take this opportunity to bring on our next guest, if he is with us. It is a huge honor and privilege to introduce our next guest, if he is here. Our next guest is Mr. Alberto Gracias Watson, Spanish journalist and activist. He has been active in the pro-Palestine cause from an early age. He is a former correspondent for the Hispan TV in Beirut and was covering news from Lebanon and Syria and collaborating with press as an international international analyst for Hispan TV, Press TV, RT, Sputnik, and other alternative media across Latin America as well to date. So that is a background on him. Hello, Alberto. We welcome you to the show.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine.
It is a privilege and honor, of course, to have you join us with your breadth of experience in journalism, in covering important events, and working with these various media outlets who we've been discussing are at the forefront of having an alternative view and presenting an alternative opinion in opposite to what is purported and what is pushed by the mainstream media. So once again, as we have been discussing with everyone, I would love to hear from you in terms of what is your view and your take on this in terms of the media and alternative media being able to express and journalists being able to do their work freely without intimidation, without threats, and how you feel that these freedom of expressions are being violated and what can be done.
Well, to start with, I'm going to talk about Spain, which is the country I'm from and where I'm talking from at this point. And I would have to say that Spain, many people think that it's actually an advanced democracy, is an open country with a freedom of expression and freedom of press. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Spain came just a few decades ago out of a fascist dictatorship that kept most of rights, didn't allow basically any rights. There was a sort of ISIS ultra-Catholic dictatorship, unfortunately, that kept this country until 1975 in the shadow of the rest of Europe. And unfortunately, what happened when the dictator died in 1975 is that the expectations that this country was going to become an open, free country did not actually achieve those expectations, because most of the structures of the dictatorship moved into the democracy, and the judiciary in particular kept most of General Franco's laws, the ones that he created. 1 out of 4 laws created by Franco still today present in our legal system today. And when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of press, I have to say that it's actually quite poor. I have worked for a couple of years with Iranian TV channel, first as an analyst since 2013 until now, but I was also a correspondent for this TV channel. Hispan TV is actually the version in Spanish of Press TV. I was in Lebanon as a correspondent of this TV channel in the region in the Middle East, and unfortunately, this TV channel was banned in Spain in 2013 by the government, the conservative government that at that time was ruling this country, because understood that in the frame of the sanctions against Iran, they should also ban the Iranian TV channels. And besides, they claimed, the Spanish government, that the poor human rights record of Iran actually pushed them to ban this channel that had the main office, the central office in Madrid. So that was an aspect that moved me a year later to offer myself to move to the Middle East as a correspondent, because what I actually admired, I used to follow Press TV and RT are my favorite channels, and of course this Iranian channel in Spanish language needed a correspondent in the Middle East, and I offered myself to go, and those were two of the most wonderful years I had spent, not only because I love the Middle East and I love the Arab spirits and the Arab culture, but because it was the center of the world at that time, and the events were happening there. I had been previously in the Gaza Strip, and in the Gaza Strip, all the events, I happened to even be in the Gaza Strip at the time in November 2012, when the Israelis started a military offensive against the Strip, and the view actually those news had in Spain, and the interpretation of those news in Spain was so wrong that they, as I said, the year after, I moved to Lebanon to cover basically the violence, the terrible terrorist situation, the Takfiri violence in Lebanon and just on the border with Syria. And I was actually involved in Syria also with the news channel. And what I mean is that when you see on the field what's going on, when you hear in the Spanish TV that the moderate opposition is trying to fight the Al-Assad regime, this bloodthirsty regime that kills the people, that when they open their mouth, that they take the nails of the children that protested in the first protest in the spring of 2011 in Daraa. And then you're actually there, you talk to the people, and they laugh when you talk about the moderate opposition, when actually the opposition, the main opposition there were Takfiri groups, Wahhabi groups that were brought from outside, mercenary activity, violence, extreme violence that was not portrayed in the Western media. Only, as I said, it's, you had RT or you had Press TV, you had Hispan TV, the Spanish version of Press TV, to show the reality of what was going on in the Middle East, what was going on in Syria or in Lebanon or in the Gaza Strip. And that's why I was actually very disappointed with my own country, the legislation of this country that eventually banned this TV channel. Like it has banned also RT in English. You cannot find RT in English in Spain. It's actually very, very difficult. You have to go online to get it. So the freedom of speech in Spain is actually very questionable, because the laws that were created, not the laws that were dragged after the death of the fascist dictators, but actually laws like in 2015, there was a citizen security law that it was approved by the total majority of the conservative government in Spain, that would not allow you, for example, to take a photograph of a policeman when this policeman was actually beating up a person down on the floor, or you could actually not even write, you cannot cross the red lines that the government has installed in Twitter or another social media, and you could actually be fined with a lot of money. Here, for example, we have puppeteers, we have Twitterers, we have rappers, musicians and comedians that are in prison in Spain because the legislation does not allow them to cross the so-called red lines. It's actually embarrassing when I say this, because most of people think that Spain is a very happy country, it's a very lovable people that actually portrays to the rest of the world happiness, but actually it's very much of the opposite, because we have over 30% of the population living under the poverty line in this country, and there are certain aspects that you cannot even reflect in the media because goes against these laws. You cannot touch, for example, the figure of the king. Now you can, because actually you had all this international media that it was portraying what the previous king, the father of the present king, was doing, his scandalous, dubious private life, his businesses with regimes like the Saudis, and you cannot even talk about it. We will hear about the French press or the German press or even the British press talking about it, but you cannot even talk about it here in Spain. You could go to prison. And it's like with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had powers given by the Franco regime in the 50s. In the 1953, they actually signed an agreement with the Vatican that gave powers to the Catholic Church in ways that were actually unbelievable. Actually, it's embarrassed. And that agreement from 1953 is still present today. Like I said, many laws of the Franco regime. So when it comes to freedom of expression, Spain has a lot of deficiencies, and we see that actually when this happened, the banning of this Iranian TV channel, it was the first country doing that to an Iranian TV channel in the world. Not even the United States are going that far, and therefore actually we have to be very critical with the situation in Spain that doesn't provide and doesn't give the right to people to openly talk about this. I'm doing it here because I'm talking in a forum that is an international forum, and I'm talking in a language that probably doesn't understand me. But unfortunately, Spain, together with Turkey, represents, as a matter of fact, Spain is the first country in the world. I think the second one is Turkey, with the biggest amount of artists that are in prison for activities or for social media or for theater or music or whatever. 14 people are in prison. We have a rapper that at this moment is in exile in Brussels. We have the president of the region of Catalonia is also in exile because he actually settled the 1st of October of 2017 for a referendum, an independence referendum, where we all could see in TV how the police and the paramilitary forces here were beating up on the people in an outrageous way. But we couldn't even take photographs or films because under the law, the security defense law that it was installed in 2015, you were not even allowed to do that. So it's actually quite sad that I have to say this about my own country, but unfortunately when you see that people go to prison for opening their mouth and actually they're talking like this person that is in exile now in Brussels because he sang a rap criticizing the King Juan Carlos that today is so-called in exile in United Arab Emirates because of the problems with taxes. So there are certain aspects that are actually very sad in this country, and freedom of speech is one of them, definitely.
Yes, definitely. Exactly what you're saying about what impression we have of Spain, at least in the world, as being this very sunny destination and its beaches and being a party destination, especially people from the UK, a holiday destination, and so on. And yet, he mentioned, as you mentioned, that the number of artists, the number of rappers, musicians, as you mentioned, but also political activists who are imprisoned for their opinions and their views. One thing I want to ask you is that one thing that me and Dr. Marcus had discussed is how aware the population are to the violation of freedom of expression. We mentioned how there are distractions, or there are ways in which the average person in the British public is perhaps ignorant to what is actually going on, and they're distracted by other issues and very far removed from what's going on in society. How would, from your analysis and from your view, would you say that the Spanish public are aware of the fact that there are some laws related to freedom of expression which still are here today from the time of the fascist dictatorship, and of course the security laws that came after. Would you say that there is a level of awareness amongst the Spanish public, or are they ignorant to it?
Well, unfortunately, the Spanish people are not that interested in what's really going on abroad. They watch news, but actually it's not one single TV channel that has a different narrative than the official narrative. When they, for example, talk, and this reminds me the last military operation of Israel in the Gaza Strip, where 67 Israeli military were killed, 6 civilians, and 2,250 Palestinians were killed. Over 500 of them were children. The 80% of the Palestinians killed were actually civilians, but the 80% of the Israelis killed were actually military. The BBC said there were crimes on both sides. That's the way it remains. And when you ask anyone here in this country, they will say, yeah, that's terrible. These people are always killing each other. The difference is that one has the most modern armies in the world, and it's a nuclear power, while the other one does not have an army, does not have an air force, hasn't got a navy, and therefore it's not in the same proportion the way that you can fight against in a war. That's actually a massacre. So for most of the Spanish that watch the official TV, and the official TV is just about the public TV station plus all the other non-public TVs. They say exactly the same. It seems like it's sent from Tel Aviv, and it's repeated here like a caricature. As a matter of fact, in the last offensive in the Gaza Strip, the public TV actually had a very, very good correspondent for Middle East. It was called, she's called Yolanda Alvarez. And Yolanda Alvarez showed and portrayed what was going on, the attacks, indiscriminate attacks on the civilian population in the Gaza Strip by the Israeli forces. And eventually the ambassador of Israel in Madrid made a protest claiming that the Spanish correspondent was showing and portraying the situation wrongly, and that she was actually an agent of Hamas. She was working for Hamas, and she was exaggerating what actually was happening in Gaza. This correspondent had her contract suspended, and she had to return back to Madrid. That is what the Spanish authorities did when Israel actually complained that what it was portrayed and shown in Gaza, that actually was the correct view of what was going on, was actually working for Hamas. And this is unfortunately Spain. Spain follows the narrative of the BBC, follows the narrative of the German outlets or the French ones, and we have to accept what they say. And the majority of the people in Spain, unfortunately, are more interested about what's going on in the football league and other aspects of the reality shows that that you can see in TV and every single channel, more than actually what's going on around the world. And this is actually poor, because solidarity is widespread in Spain. There's a lot of movements and NGOs participating in different parts of the world. And that they will be aware that actually the Spanish government sells weapons to Saudi Arabia, weapons which, like the last contract of the 5 warships that were sold there, are actually participating in the blocking of Hodeidah, humanitarian entry harbor in Yemen, where the people are actually dying of hunger. It's an absolute genocide what's going on there, and the Spanish are participating from it. The Spanish are selling weapons to Saudi Arabia in enormous amounts that are used in this terrible genocide that is going on in Yemen. But not only that, many of the weapons that Spain sells to Saudi Arabia and Qatar end or have ended in the hands of Daesh. ISIS said not too long ago, 2 or 3 years ago, that their favorite pistols actually are the Spanish ones, the Astra and the Star weapons, guns that the Spanish actually built here. And this only comes through the selling of weapons to nations like Saudi Arabia and Qatar that are financing, sponsoring, and arming these terrorist groups that has absolutely destroyed big parts of the Middle East, and fortunately now are seeing their future quite dark, because in Syria, the very last time that I was there, situation has changed, has overturned, and basically apart from Idlib, which is what is still in Spain, it's considered to be the last enclave of democratic moderate rebels, is about to fall any moment. So we've seen the falling of ISIS also in Iraq, and Lebanon has its borders pretty much safe thanks to Hezbollah, the Shia militia, and basically that war that we were all scared that it was going to just end with a whole Middle East under the caliphate of Daesh, for the benefit, obviously, of the American purposes of exploiting the natural resources like the oil and the gas. It's not happening. Well, it's still happening in the north of Syria thanks to the help of the Kurds, but it will eventually end. This is actually something that Spanish are not aware of, because they will be aware of the Spanish implication even when Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 was assassinated by the Western forces just to get the oil and the gas of Libya. If the Spanish would have known that Spanish money is used for such atrocities, and now they converted Libya in a failed state, in an absolute failing state, the Spanish would actually take the streets. But that's why this security defense law that it was installed in Spain, they're not even allowed that people would be called for protest on social media, and it would be even punished up to 600,000 euros of fines. So they try to keep the people quiet. They try to keep the people intoxicated with information that happens around the world. And yes, we can see most of the Champions League football matches and sports events and the reality shows on TV, but we're not really aware of what's going on, because the Spanish TV happened to ban one of the most important channels in the Spanish language, and keeps the interest of the population in other aspects apart from information.
Dr. Marcus, feel free to wade in to the discussion. Hopefully have it as an open discussion if we can.
Yes, most certainly. One of Alberto's observations, I think, is particularly pertinent for this evening's discussion, and that is what happened on the first day in Syria of the so-called Syrian revolution, namely that police officers, soldiers and Syrian civilians were abducted by extremists, militants, murdered, and their bodies were dismembered. Yet, despite that being, of course, common knowledge amongst the Syrian population, BBC News never chose to report on that. That actuality should provoke a thought in the minds of a British person or a Spanish person or a Swedish person. Why would BBC News, which purports to be independent and free, choose not to cover such heinous acts? There is only one conclusion, and that is BBC News is neither independent nor free. It is the British establishment's mouthpiece. It is funded by the British state, and it is directed by the British state. And following on from Alberto's other excellent observations, and very, very articulately said, if the average person in Britain, in Spain and Sweden is not inclined to care per se about what happens in the Balkans or North Africa and the Middle East, then they will most certainly care about the ramifications for British society, Spanish society and Swedish society of the wars which their respective governments have caused in those regions. So, in the case of all three countries, Britain, Spain and Sweden, because of the assistance that the West gave to the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, which is a terrorist organisation, it's an organised crime syndicate, there is an abundance of Albanian organised crime in Britain, Spain and Sweden. That involves child trafficking, gun trafficking and human trafficking and paedophilia. That is as a result of British, Spanish and Swedish foreign policies. And when it comes to North Africa, when it comes to the Middle East, because of the support that Britain, Spain and also Sweden, but to a lesser extent, gave to terrorists, Wahhabist terrorists in Libya and Syria, the threat, the terrorist and extremist threat to British society, Spanish society and Swedish society has increased tenfold. And finally, the British public, the Spanish public and the Swedish public should know the dire consequences of their three respective countries having strategic partnerships with Saudi Arabia, because as a result of those strategic partnerships, Saudi Arabia has a presence in Spain, Britain and Sweden. Why is it that the British state rescinded the broadcasting license of Press TV, but does not ban Wahhabist sermons coming out of Saudi Arabia to Britain, to Spain, to Sweden, where they are talking about, clearly, this is not a matter of interpretation, those Saudi sermons, Wahhabist sermons, are clearly talking about killing Christians. They're clearly talking about killing women who work. So the average person in Britain, Spain and Sweden has to be told, ask yourselves, why is it that Britain takes action against an Iranian news channel but does not take action against sermons which are coming out of Saudi Arabia and which, quite frankly, have created a cancer, certainly in Britain, also in Spain, and also, but to a lesser extent, in Sweden?
It really does raise the important question of where their alliances lie, whether it's really about media freedoms, and if it was about media freedoms, then at the very least you would say that all of them would be treated in the same way. If the reasons that they gave to ban, let's say, Press TV, if they applied it to another organization, you may disagree with the banning, but at the very least you'd say that there is a consistency in the way they're applying what they believe to be the law. I want to ask Alberto, do you not feel that, we mentioned maybe the Spanish may not have an inclination towards knowing what happens abroad because they feel it may not concern them. Do you not feel that the Spanish people have the right to know how their taxpayers' money is being used? Because ultimately it's money that is being used for aid in foreign countries, it's money that is spent on the military in foreign countries, especially as you said, there is the case of poverty and homelessness in Spain. So do the Spanish people not have the right to know where their tax money is going?
Absolutely, but I want to correct myself because actually I didn't mean to say that Spanish are not interested. What I meant to say is that Spanish are happy with the news that they receive. The official narrative is acceptable for Spanish. That's what actually I meant. The Spanish, obviously, like the rest of the world, have the right to know what's going on and what's going on around the world where the Spanish interests are involved. And when it comes, for example, with this situation that I first mentioned before, for Saudi Arabia, when 2 years ago the King of Spain have gone to Riyadh with 400 businessmen from the weapons, from arms businessmen, to sell weapons actually to the Saudi regime, the Spanish obviously are not aware that many of those weapons are going to be used eventually against civilians. And that is the point. Why don't we hear about the right news? Why don't we hear that, as I mentioned before, the 5 Navy ships that were sold to Saudi Arabia are blocking the entrance of humanitarian aid to the Hodeidah harbor in Yemen, where the people are dying of hunger, where the enormous amounts of children are dying of diseases. 50% of the people are in danger of malnutrition. And Spanish ships are participating, therefore, in the blocking of that harbor where actually the humanitarian aid should come in. Or, as I mentioned also, weapons that are used in Syria and Iraq to kill civilians. Because what many people don't understand is that the so-called Islamic groups, they're not Islamic, they're not Islamists. 80% of the victims are Muslims. And those are the real victims, not those that eventually unnecessarily die in Paris or in Belgium or in Spain in these terrorist attacks. The biggest amount of victims that die at the hands of these Wahhabi Tafsiri groups are actually Muslims. The majority of the people that die are civilians. So when it comes, for example, to what happens in Lebanon, which is a small country but has an access to the sea, and that's why Daesh had an interest in Lebanon. At the time that I was there in 2014, 2015, they were trying heavily to enter Lebanon, to take over Lebanon, and be able to have a way out so they could export and import. Export the oil that they were stealing from Iraq and Syria, and import more mujahideen mercenaries that will fight together with them. Lebanon had this problem up in the north and had another problem in the south. The problem in the south is Israel, who continuously is trying to violate the airspace, even the land. I made a report, an interview to Paolo Serra, that time the commandant of the UNIFIL Blue Helmet Forces in southern Lebanon, and off the camera he told me that they were sick and tired of the hundreds of reports that they have to do of the Israeli violation of the Lebanese territory that they have to send on a monthly basis to New York, to the Office of United Nations, and how it's never heard that so many violations are not responded with any resolution or with any sanctions. So Lebanon actually is a small country that is suffering now a tremendous crisis, and people don't even know much about Lebanon. The only possibility for Lebanon, or for the people around the world to know about what's going on in Lebanon in Spanish language, is our TV station, our TV channel over there. Unfortunately, we were targeted very often with the elimination and suspension of our accounts, if it was Twitter, if it was YouTube, if it was Facebook, you name it, because it's not an interest that the people know what's going on. And the Spanish soldier of this humanitarian blue helmet forces, the UNIFIL, was killed by Israel. And Israel, the same day, actually apologized to the Spanish authorities. But when the investigation was opened, they claimed that they had nothing to do with it, that this was an open fire between Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and the Israeli forces. So it was not clear who was actually involved. Everyone knew that this soldier, actually from my same town here in Spain, from Malaga, was killed by a mortar fire fired by Israeli forces. And Spain never made a protest against Israel, against what happened. And the news in Spain never portrayed what actually really happened, which was that Israel, very far away from the Hezbollah positions, had fired against a military base of the UNIFIL forces in southern Lebanon. Of course, if you do not know about what's going on, you show no interest. And the Spanish, unfortunately, have very little interest of what's going on with the humanitarian missions that they have abroad, especially when the news are, these people are always fighting the others. Oh, there's the Lebanese and the Israelis, the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Syrians and the Israelis. But unfortunately, the Israelis are at war with every single neighbor they have, apart from those that submitted to Trump's orders of actually started diplomatic relationship with Israel. And we're not aware of that either. Spain used to be, until 1989, a country that had no diplomatic relationship with Israel. Until NATO, Spain is a member of NATO, and some pro-Israel lobbies, very strong lobbies in the United States, pressurized Spain to start diplomatic relations with that country, with that entity, with that regime. And unfortunately, Spanish are not aware that the damage that created with the Arab world. Spain had a fantastic relation with the Arab world, deteriorated immensely because of Spain having to accept, by pressure, to start relationships with a country that did not respect and violate systematically the human rights, not only of the Palestinians, but at that time the Syrians, basically all the countries around Israel, and the way that Israel interprets the international law. Spain, if people would actually know what's going on, not just in the Middle East, because when we come to media, we can also talk about Cuba and Venezuela. When the Spanish media talks about Venezuela, it talks about the Chavista regime. When it talks about Cuba, it talks about the dictatorship of the Castro brothers. They don't even name the country anymore. And that is a narrative that doesn't come from Spain. Those were former colonies. Those are former colonies of Spain. Spain should actually have a better relationship with those nations. But unfortunately, the narrative says that Venezuela is an enemy to the Spanish interests, and so is Cuba. And that is absolutely ridiculous. About talking about regimes, Spain also, when you see the news and the breaking news, when they talk about Iran, they talk about the Ayatollah regime. That's something so absurd. When they talk about the Syrian army, they talk about the forces loyal to al-Assad. When they talk about the defense response defense forces, they talk about the white helmets, and actually Syria has its own defense, civilian defense forces that were created in 1953. But the manipulation of the news obviously makes the Spanish uninterested in what's going on around the world, because they accept what the TV says, and they don't actually question the narrative of the official news that we get here in Spain. And I don't think it's very different in other countries. In 2011, in the month of May, in 2011, I was a member of the Second Freedom Flotilla that was going to Gaza. After a year earlier, the Israeli forces committed a massacre to the first flotilla in international waters. So we went with the humanitarian aid, and Spain had just signed with Israel an agreement in security matters. So the Israelis had sent the Spanish government a letter threatening with doing with our flotilla exactly what they did with the first one. And far away from starting a diplomatic conflict with Israel, the Spanish authorities wanted to forbid us from going to Gaza. As a matter of fact, we actually had to leave direction to Gaza from Greece, from the Greek islands, from Crete. And eventually, even there, we had the Greek Navy imposing a blockade on the harbor that we were trying to leave from. So we were not able, we were sort of prisoners for 3 weeks in Greece, because Israel had given orders first to the Spanish government and then to the Greek government. So the power that some nations have, and those are nations that are allies of the United States. If we're talking about Saudi Arabia, we're talking about Israel. They are friends and allies of the United States. They have common interests in the Middle East. One of the biggest interests is to stop the influence that Iran has in the region. Iran has a wider and has expanded their influence in the region, but not by exporting takfiri or terrorist groups. Very much the opposite. They're helping nations to keep their security, if it's in Lebanon, or if it's in Syria, or even in Iraq.
Right.
They're helping even the Germany's confronting this genocidal situation that they're suffering from the Saudis. However, for the interest of the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia in the region, Iran represents a danger. And they're trying to stop this danger from expanding any further by doing what they're doing with Iran, the sanctions. And it hasn't helped the American interest. Iran is stronger now than it's been ever, even though their economy is really very much affected by the sanctions. However, the signing of the treaty with China is going to help out very much. But the situation that is going on now in the United States' interest on putting more pressure has proven not to be effective. And eventually we're going to see that before the elections in Iran, Americans are going to change their view on the sanctions.
Definitely. Definitely very insightful, very deep analysis into that, and just how one group of people or countries can get away with something. Alberto mentioned the breaches of sovereignty, of course, with regards to Israeli incursion into Lebanon, which goes unchecked for and unaccounted for. And yet any other country who would do similar would have complete outrage in the global political community. But I thank Alberto Watson so much for being on our show. His insightful analysis, thorough analysis of the situation in Spain, and what lessons we can learn from the circumstance and situation in Spain, and perhaps apply and relate to the problems that are at hand there. I believe we have Dr. Alf Sandmark with us, who has come back from Sweden. Dr. Alf Sandmark joining us on Skype from Sweden, hopefully. Doctor, unfortunately, our discussion earlier with you was cut off slightly. Given what we've been discussing, we looked at the perspectives of the British perspective and the influence of the British state. We've looked at, you yourself discussed the Sweden and the Swedish state, and we also had the views of Spain and how the Spanish state seeks to influence the media by pushing one certain narrative and blocking out all other narratives. And so, well, with this in mind, given these things, what would you say is Sweden's point of view in terms of, in comparison, given how it's playing out in Spain and Britain? Would you say that comparatively in Europe and amongst these countries, it's perhaps worse in Sweden, better? And in any of those cases, what could be done in terms of bettering those problems? Dr. Alf, are you with us? I believe we are just trying to reach Dr. Alf. But in the meantime, whilst we try and get to him, Dr. Marcus, you of course heard the rest of his of Alberto Watson's analysis. With regards to that, what more do you have to say in terms of the breaches, in terms of the lobbying power as well? We've talked a lot about the British state on the direct governmental influence, but not so much on lobbying power and how they can influence the lobby. We obviously talk about the Israeli lobby, such as obviously the most well-known one is AIPAC in the United States. What can you shed in terms of the power of lobbies in influencing the media narrative as opposed to direct state control?
I personally have grave concerns about the lobbying industry. It's not a matter of me being opposed to lobbying per se. I think lobbying is a very important part of parliamentary politics. However, what does concern me is the disproportionate amount of influence that only a handful of lobby groups exert, for example, in America or in Britain. That is a great concern, because why should it be the case that one lobby group, which is funded each year to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, should have more influence, should have a greater say, for example, at the Houses of Parliament, than another lobby group which is funded to the tune of a few £100 or a couple of thousands of pounds each year. So therein lies the reason why I have grave concerns about the lobbying industry, because what we see is a situation in which lobbyists who are unelected are exerting great influence over, for example, British foreign policy making. That is unacceptable in a democracy. I support lobbying per se in a democracy. I think it works hand in hand, but providing there are provisions in place which ensure that one lobby group does not have a greater influence than another lobby group,
right,
apart from if the other lobby group is winning the battle in terms of merits. But what we see in regard to Israeli lobby groups is that they're not so much winning discussions, right, on account of meritocracy. It's because they have so much money, and because of that, over many, many decades, they have great influence. That is the problem in a democracy.
That really does highlight the problem with lobbying groups. And as we said with a lot of what we said, in principle, per se, there isn't so much of an issue with a lot of the things we've discussed, but it's the way that it's been misused, the way that perhaps things have been exaggerated in order to go for a wrong cause. Thankfully, we now have Dr. Afsan Mark back with us. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Throughout the show, we've been discussing what parallels can be drawn between the experiences with regards to media expression in Britain, in Spain, and of course from your side in Sweden, and how international affairs are discussed. And just now as well, we were discussing the impact of lobbying, in this case in Britain and the United States. So I would like to ask you personally, in terms of Sweden, a two-part question, I suppose. One is, in comparison to other countries, from your observation within Europe, in this case Britain and Spain, do you see Sweden as having more stringent laws regarding freedom of expression in terms of what can and can't be said? Would you say it's similar or better, the situation in Sweden relative to the countries you mentioned? And then of course the other thing we mentioned, which is the lobbying power, because we've talked about state intervention and state influence, but also the influence of lobbies. Is there the space for lobbying in Sweden? So it's a two-part question there for you.
Well, it's a big problem here in Sweden, because we have a government lobby activities that are dominating the most civilian organizations in the nation. They are basically paid by the state, so they are under control. But the main thing here to break through is what Marcus speaks about, and also from Spain, the problem that people are watching this news, and they are watching these football games, they are watching these reality shows and so on. The problem here is that there has to be some hope, there has to be some wish not to see these things, to stop watching, and therefore what we need are solutions. There has to be presented solutions that are relevant not only for the rest of the world but also for Europe. And one of those main solutions are the Belt and Road Initiative, which is giving opportunity for cooperation with all the European nations and for solving the poverty problems and other things. The thing is that the Western population is the main target of this disinformation of the Western media. And what we have now from Russia Today, RT, the Press TV, China are a strong enough force to influence the Western population to join the new paradigm, and to start to want to leave these kind of reality shows and football festivities. So this is what can be turning the situation around, is if these institutions that are quite powerful also now in the West, when the Western population are so reluctant to this fake news that we have here, it is an open field to propose those solutions that can bring the world out of this dire crisis of close to world war and the starvation catastrophes going on in Yemen and Africa.
Dr. Marcus, feel free to comment as well.
Yes, I believe that there is always hope, and of course there is always the power of prayer. But aside from those two things, there is real evidence, certainly tangible evidence, that there has been an awakening of some degree in Western countries about the reality of their countries being, as they are, officially democracies. More and more British people, more and more Americans, and I suspect more and more people in Sweden and Spain have awoken to the dark realization that the media in their respective countries are not on their side. They're not their friends. That they have been treated effectively as pawns, that they have been used and abused, they have been manipulated in order to achieve or to help to achieve the objectives of the American or British establishments. It is still a relatively speaking small percentage of people who have awoken in Western countries, but nonetheless you have to start from somewhere. And history shows that anything is possible and that all is impermanent. Very few people thought that the Habsburg Empire would collapse, that the Romanov dynasty would collapse, yet they collapsed. And so for me, that history inspires me to believe that whilst the situation, certainly in the Western world today, is dire, it does not mean it will always be like this. We have to keep on seeing the emergence of more and more alternative news channels. We have to keep on relaying our understanding, our contentions to as many ordinary people in Britain and Sweden and Spain and America as possible. And we have to keep on organising and hosting highly important and wonderful, enlightening conferences like the one today. The more conferences like the one today can only help to awaken more and more people about the detrimental effects of British mainstream media or Spanish mainstream media or Swedish mainstream media or American mainstream media to the lives of ordinary people. And let's be absolutely clear about this, that mainstream media, Western mainstream media, jeopardizes the security and stability of ordinary people in Western Europe and also in North America. That is something we have to relay time and time again to the layperson in North America and in the West in general.
We have to ultimately hold on to that hope. Ultimately, if we didn't have hope, there wouldn't be the point of any of us doing what we're doing. And just a very quick comment, if you can, Dr. Alf, on Dr. Marcus's remarks about that reawakening and the the possibility of what we can do and the rise of that alternate media to counter the narrative. Just some quick concluding comments, if you may.
Well, Marcus is perfectly correct. The relaying of news from these alternative media is significant. Just look at the audience the RT has in the United States, so some 50 million people. This is power, and this power has to be used in a way to organize the new paradigm, the new solution for peaceful coexistence. And this is the way to avoid a nuclear war. And the policies of the West now is actually to just destroy their own population, their own economy, go into speculation, go into a fake climate policy that is destroying the possibility for energy for the rest of the world. And this is a policy with war to just destroy. And this means we are destroying our markets, we are destroying our future. And therefore, there is no future in the policy of the West today, and it's going down. And therefore, it's an open field for alternative media to come in.
Thank you so much. Dr. Alf Sandmark, chairman of the Schiller Institute in Sweden. As he indicated, they have a conference coming up, so I would encourage everyone, all the viewers, everyone in the audience to search out the Schiller Institute in Sweden and just to read about the work that they do, and of course awaken ourselves and enlighten ourselves and open our minds. So thank you so much, Dr.
SchillerInstitute.com.
SchillerInstitute.com to all our audience
and
our viewers. So everyone, today we discussed the effects of violations of freedom of expression, the banning of news outlets, the suspension of journalists, and just how we can tackle these issues. Is there a hope? And that's what we hold on to, the hope that there are alternative media outlets that are coming that weren't there, as we said, that weren't there decades ago. And so the public had no choice and had to resign to the fact that there was only one radio channel, the one state radio that we had to listen to, the one TV channel. And now with alternate media on the rise, and yes, there will be efforts, no doubt. They won't like the fact that there is alternate media, and there are efforts being made, as we've seen, to ban them, but so far we have seen that they have failed in silencing the alternate media. Now with the rise of social media as well, new outlets, new mediums in which the alternate media are able to project what they feel as to be the reality on the ground that is not fairly shown on the mainstream media. With these happening, we have to remain hopeful and optimistic that despite the actions being taken by the state, as has been shown in history, states fall, but the truth has to be said at all times. And so that's how I want to conclude this show. But before I do, I want to just present a token of gratitude, a small gift on behalf of the JSC Journalist Support Committee to Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos for his presence on the show. We just want to present this beautiful piece to Dr. Marcus. It's just a very small gift, to you, just show a token of appreciation. Yes. Yes, it's just a small token of appreciation, a small gift from us here to you. And we are hugely thankful to Dr. Marcus, Dr. Alf Sandmark, Alberto Watson, a journalist, and Barrister Ishaq for their insight and their incredible opinions and really enlightening us and awakening us to the realities of the world and what we can do to tackle this. Thank you to all the audience and viewers from across the world who joined in to tune into this program. And we hope you follow the Journalist Support Committee everywhere on social media. Thank you very much.